welcome back, everyone, to our third and final panel of the day. Thank you all who stuck around till the better end. I promise you that this final panel will be one of the best, one of the four best sessions of the day.
You just said better end, right?
Better.
Bitter.
This is our panel is, now that we heard the beginning of the day, sort of what's the threat we're facing. The second panel of the day was what's being done to try and address it. And so with the baseline set and the idea of what we're actually doing already, we thought it'd be great to finish the day talking about what are the things that we can still be doing. What are the policy solutions to, as I put it, stop the bad guys and help the good guys. So I'm really pleased to be joined on the stage today by four incredible experts and advocates who have been thinking about this issue in their jobs every day. And I'm really glad they could make time to be with us today. Starting at the end of the line, we have Joe Dunn. Joe is a research professor at George Washington University's Institute of Public Policy, where he's developing research projects on the use of AI in public policy. Next to Joe is Jenny Katzman. Jenny is a lawyer and policy expert who currently serves as a senior director at Microsoft, where she leads the U.S. government affairs policy efforts on intellectual property and digital safety. She is also the author, can I call you the author? I think it was principal contributor to Microsoft's tremendous research paper they put out earlier this year on on policy solutions to the emerging wave of digital fraud. So I would highly recommend that to all of you to read. Next to Jenny is Kate Griffin. Kate is running through here. This is terrible. Kate Griffin is the director of the Inclusive Financial System at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. There, she leads the National Task Force on Fraud and Scam Prevention, bringing together government, law enforcement, financial services, and consumer advocates to develop systemic strategies against fraud. And NCL is a proud member of that task force, and we'll be talking a lot about that. It's already been teed up quite a bit. And finally, we have Kate White. Kate is the Deputy Director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, where she has responsibility for the Division of Marketing Practices, Privacy and Identity Protection, and Financial Practices, and several regional offices. And so just for your edification, because we have two Kates on the dais, I'm gonna say Kate G for Aspen and Kate W for FTC. And their full bios, much more than I have time to go into today, is available at on our website for the conference, which you can access via the QR code up here on the screen, as well as on your programs. While you're at that website, I would also invite you, if you didn't get it on your way in or out, to fill out the survey about your experience today. We'd love to get feedback from all of you on your experience and what we could do good and what we could do better. So let's go ahead and move on into our policy solutions conversation. So Jenny, for those who haven't read your paper, could you give us a thumbnail sketch of what the policy descriptions Microsoft is proposing for addressing this coming wave of AI-fueled fraud?
Sure. Good. This is working. So thank you. So in July of 2024, Microsoft released a white paper on protecting the public from abusive AI-generated content. And this came following several months after Microsoft's president, Brad Smith, laid out a comprehensive approach to addressing this type of content. And that approach had 6 different areas that he felt that we needed to look at, which were comprehensive architecture, so looking at making sure your models, everything from the application, the model, all the sort of layers of the tech stack are looking at how to address this. And then that includes things like, red teaming, not just from the beginning, but in making that sort of an iterative process, and using classifiers, taking back user feedback, doing everything like that. And then the second part of that being durable media, provenance, and watermarking. And those are ways of knowing where your content is coming from. The third being addressing abusive content and conduct on platforms, so blocking users who are posting bad, really abusive things or illegal things or contributing to a hostile or an abusive environment. The fourth being working across with partners, either civil society, government partners, and across in the tech industry. And the fifth being modernized legislation. That's where the white paper is. And the sixth one being education. And so the fifth one being modernized legislation, that's where the white paper contributed to. And what we wanted to do in the U.S. was to lay out for U.S. policymakers, both on the state and the federal level, what can be done to address this abusive AI-generated content, while also encouraging innovation, because obviously Microsoft has a interest in ensuring that AI is allowed to continue to innovate. And we looked at 4 particular harms, and AI fraud was one of them. And we laid out a number of bills that we thought were really good in a lot of different spaces. In the AI fraud space, we didn't see one that we thought was really a good one to sort of model. And so we thought of what we thought, looking back at other concerning issues in the past, what could be a good template. And what we saw was the Truth and Caller ID Act as like a good template of a bill. And we proposed a bill to be modeled after that, which would include both civil and criminal penalties. Criminal penalties to be enforced by DOJ, civil penalties to be enforced by the Federal Trade Commission, and then also empowering state attorneys general to be able to bring suits on behalf of their residents for civil remedies as well. And that would increase the surface area, knowing that fraud, even without AI involvement, is such a huge issue that AI would increase that uptake. But we wanted to ensure that enough people in the legal space and the law enforcement space could bring action on behalf of those victims of these types of scams.
Thank you so much. And I think, that kind of scholarship is exactly what's needed in this space, is real policy recommendations. Because I think, as you heard in our conversation with Mark just a few minutes ago, is, at least from my point of view as somebody who tries to stay on top of this, I still feel disoriented. And I know that many policymakers feel the same way. They recognize the threats out there, and they're looking for solutions. So I think having more ideas out there circulating here in Washington and around the country is really important to how we start to get a handle on this. Kate W. So we spent a lot of time on in some of our former in our past panels today talking about the role that the FTC plays here, and I think there are a lot of opinions about what you should be doing, and I wonder if you could talk about what you currently are doing. So what existing authorities are you relying on to address AI-enabled fraud? And what are some of the cases maybe that you've brought recently? I think we talked about Ryder on the first panel today, but other cases and activities the FTC is doing to try and address this issue today.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I have to give the disclaimer that my views are my own. They're not that of the commission or any individual commissioners. But fraud is bread and butter activity, like fighting fraud is bread and butter activity of the FTC. It is a priority for Chairman Ferguson, and we have just the most dogged and talented staff that is taking on fraud. And AI, certainly, you see old frauds that are enhanced by AI. You see, AI sort of inspiring like new ways for folks to try to deceive consumers, and the FTC is constantly out there, bringing cases using our existing authorities. Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair and deceptive practices, the TSR, the imposter rule. We have a lot of tools, and we are bringing them to bear. And even in the past year, in the past 6 months, in the past 2 weeks, we've brought cases that sort of cover the waterfront of the types of frauds we're seeing. So, for example, there's a lot of business opportunity scams out there. Like, people are really, compelled and captured by AI, and they hear like there's this business opportunity. We're going to give you like this. We're going to have a wonderful like Amazon e-com business. It's all going to be done for you. $20,000, you're all set. And we see those sorts of patterns. We brought cases against folks, Ascend Ecom, FBA Business Solutions, cases like that. AI, people who are just making false earnings claims to folks. You also see people who are selling AI tools, and they're they're maybe overselling what they can do. So we brought a case against Workato. That company said, we have created this wonderful tool. We've trained it, with a wide variety of materials, and it can, give you 98% accuracy whether something piece of writing was created with the AI. But it turns out it wasn't trained in the way that they said. It had a very limited, set of tools it was trained on, and it had a 53%, accuracy rate. So we say, well, that's plain old deception, right? So we brought those cases in areas where they're fraud, but maybe they're not the types of fraud where we think about instantly sort of like stealing money from people. We're very concerned about the creation of, apps that sort of help create like nude images and like those sorts of deep fake things. And so the Take It Down Act is going to become effective in May. We'll be enforcing that, and that covers all non-consensual imagery. So we're gearing up to be robust enforcers of that law. And we're also, to respond a little bit to the speaker earlier, we are using our tools to engage with sort of chatbots, especially with how they affect children. So last week we put out, or this week, I don't know, time flies. We used our 6B authority to go out and ask, a lot of AI chatbot companies like how, questions about the development and use and impact of their products on children.
Got it. And Joe, from your point of view, we also talked on our last panel about, we've heard from Kate W. about the role that the FTC is playing, but we know that a lot of the conversation and frankly the regulation that's happening in the space for AI generally, but also about AI and fraud specifically, is happening overseas. How have countries or organizations that represent blocks of countries like the EU and the OECD, how are they approaching the threat of AI and fraud differently than we are here in the US? And are there lessons, positive or cautionary, that we should take from them?
Yes, thank you, John. It's on, right?
Good, yep.
Yeah. Yes, and in fact, thank you for inviting me here. Before I was a research professor at GW, I worked for many years in the European Parliament, so I have a background in EU legislation, so I'm very happy to sort of give the European perspective. But I've also worked for a long time with the Congress and worked here a lot, so I think I have a very good understanding of how things work in the US. And it's certainly true that the regulatory philosophy is different, but the problems are the same effectively. And in fact, it may even be the case, I'm not sure about the figures, but I think that the problems that we're talking about today have hit Europe twice as badly as the US. I mean, the figures that you mentioned this morning, earlier panels mentioned about the impact of AI-driven fraud in the US. The corresponding figures in Europe are twice as bad. I'm not quite sure why this is the case, because in fact we have a more stringent regulatory approach. As you know, the Europeans like to regulate ex ante, whereas you have this litigation approach. The FTC sort of examines things after you allow things to happen, and then you look to see if there's need to regulate. I think it may be because the EU has this fear of fragmentation, or because the EU is about integrating countries which have very different histories, so we have this fear of fragmentation. So the first instinct is always to organize. So let's organize this, let's systematize this. Whereas the US instinct is more, let's leave it to the market forces. Let's see what happens. So I don't know if now, John, you want me to talk a little bit about the EU regulatory approach in this area?
Yes.
By my count, there are 6 instruments. So the AI Act was referenced rightly so in the last session with Mark Rottenberg and also this morning. But there are sort of 3 relevant pieces of legislation which exist, and there are 3 in the pipeline, which all in different ways tackle the problem, because of course, as was said this morning, the problem cuts across several sectors and it's very difficult to deal with. So it's very difficult you can't deal with the problem with one single piece of legislation. So what we have already on the books in Europe is the General Product Safety Directive, and there is a Product Liability Directive, and the Product Liability Directive was recently revised to include digital products. So it can be used in the way, as I think Kate said, existing legislation can be used. It's the same in Europe. We also have the Digital Services Act, which I know is controversial in the US, but it does regulate the conduct of online platforms. At least that's the intention. So illegal manipulation could theoretically be tackled by the DSA. But what we have coming is a ban on deepfakes, which is I think the key part of the AI Act, which will come into force in August of next year, in August 26. There is a specific financial instrument, which is sort of taking up all the bandwidth in Brussels at the moment on the Payment Services Directive and the Payment Services Regulation. So this I could talk about in more detail later or now as you wish, but this is tackling the core problem of the financial impact on consumers. So who pays, what's the liability regime? So if a consumer is scammed, or if there's a bank impersonation scam, for example, who pays? And the draft legislation, which is now in the informal trilogue stage, which is the equivalent of your conference committee stage, it currently foresees that banks and other financial institutions would be liable for some of these scams. Although in the end, the consumer organization Euro Equivalent in Europe calculates that it still would be the case that 86% of the damages would have to be paid by consumers, but certainly financial institutions would cover some of the damage. And the last instrument is the Digital Fairness Act, which is in the works. There is currently a public consultation ongoing where everybody is welcome to contribute. It's also possible to contribute from the US. We're very open in our public consultations. And there the idea would be to look at manipulations, sort of dark patterns, to tackle these kind of new sort of bad actions which happen. You mentioned also the OECD, and of course there in other international organizations the emphasis is more on voluntary participation, voluntary contributions and best practices, but probably the EU is the only jurisdiction which is trying to put firm rules on the table as usual. So perhaps that's enough for now.
No, I think it leads me perfectly into my question for Kate Griffin. Kate, we've talked about sort of the specific regulatory and legal activities underway at the EU, the 4 bills that Joe just talked about. We've talked about with Kate W. about how the existing laws on the books for the FTC are being used to go after AI-fueled fraud. We've talked about the new legislation, the Take It Down Act, focused specifically on deepfakes. But I think you would probably agree that despite this, we don't have a national policy on addressing this issue. And I think there remains sort of a need for one. And you, in your as a huge glutton for punishment, took on the challenge of bringing together, is it 80 different organizations to tackle that issue? Can you talk about the work you're doing on the National Task Force and how it relates to this growing problem of AI-fueled fraud?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for seeing it for what it is.
Yes.
No. So first, the thing I'll say is that the way that I enter this conversation right now, at least a little bit, is from the perspective of what is the crime being committed. The work that John is talking about has really focused on when consumers are victims of sophisticated social engineering tactics that induce them to send money or access to a financial service. So there are some pieces here where we're talking about other issues around child sexual exploitation and things like that. I don't have expertise to be able to talk to those terrible things. And the National Task Force for Fraud and Scam Prevention essentially arose because there were many institutions, law enforcement officials, agencies working on different aspects of fighting against the scam problem. And what we heard from every one of them is, I'm doing everything I can, man, but I can't do this alone. Because it's a complex problem. And the part of the problem is that the criminals are exploiting the fact that within America, at least, and I think there are some similarities in other places, they are exploiting ecosystems that have very different legal and regulatory environments. If you think about the ways that social media or online platforms are treated legally in their own way, different from telecommunications, different from financial services, et cetera. And yet those are all of the systems the criminals are using when they deploy these AI tools to commit their crimes. And so one of the sort of clarion calls of that work was to say, in order for us to have really kind of systemic preventative impact to prevent criminals from accessing consumers in the first place, we need to think about this whole of ecosystem approach that addresses the weaknesses in any one of those systems and how we can foster greater collaboration among them in order to get better at catching the bad guys and deterring that kind of crime.
And are there any important dates coming up on the calendar that we should be aware of for what the National Task Force is doing?
That's a leading question, John. So stay tuned. October 1st, we'll be dropping the strategy, or sort of it's a blueprint for a national strategy, I should say. We're a private institution, and it's a set of recommendations that were arrived through, I would say, thousands of hours of contributions from many experts in this room. So thank you for your time and your service. And it's quite a comprehensive look. It's not a small document, so cozy up with some coffee, and sort of takes the reader on a journey from everything that we need to do in terms of actions in the countries where criminals live, through our systems of commerce and communication and financial services, and what needs to happen in terms of consumer-facing awareness and education.
Great, thank you.
John, can I say something
Please
on this
go
point?
for it.
Yeah, so when we talk about collaboration, first of all, I want to say I think the task force is fantastic. Microsoft is really proud to be part of it, along with so many others. But when we talk about collaboration, I can't really underscore how incredibly important it is, because in sort of any of these areas, sometimes you see bad actors, they start on one platform and then they take their bad actions to another and you lose them, right? And so unless you're talking to each other and you're sharing information, there's no way to trace that. And this has been done in other ways, which has been proven to be very successful. Like this was thought about, just recently last year, like when companies came together in the Tech Accord, which was around elections, when we were saying, hey, we're going to see similar things across platforms. What can we do to share information? And there was agreements among tech companies to do that, to say, hey, if we're going to see this on one platform, we're going to see it on another platform. Let's share the information so that if we're seeing, deep fakes, on so-and-so's, social media one, we'll make sure that that information is shared across the different, ecosystem, so that we can rapidly ensure that it is removed, if it's determined to be false, and, or ensure that everybody has that information to make that same determination, right? And that is a really helpful way to do it. And I think what we see at Microsoft, and I think this is shared, but I will only speak for Microsoft, is that while we are fierce competitors when it comes to so many different things, when it comes to safety, we don't see that as a competition. And I think fraud is one example of this. And we invest a lot in this, particularly in the fraud space. At Microsoft, we have a digital crimes unit, which also, in terms of collaboration, goes far beyond just the, the partnerships in civil society and in the tech space, but also does collaboration with governments. And that's not just in the US, but, all over the world. And that's because of what you were just talking about, which is that there aren't, borders when it comes to these sort of crimes. So just wanted to add that point. Thanks.
Thank you. And I realized as you were chatting that I talked about your paper earlier, but I didn't actually give people a name to Google. The name of Jenny's paper is Protecting the Public from Abusive AI-Generated Content. So if you're looking for something to read on your way home after this conference, heartily recommend it. Kate W., your mention of the 6B letters going out got my wheels turning. And the FTC in your toolbox, you have obviously your enforcement authority, your rulemaking authority, but the FTC also plays a really important role in terms of providing guidance to industries that you regulate. Can you give a sense for folks, is guidance something that for AI and sort of AI fueled fraud and misuse of these technologies for fraud, is that something that is, I know you can't talk about future policies, but is providing guidance something that you think could be useful in this space?
I don't know if there's a lot of guidance to give to business about fraud, right? Because there's fraudsters and then there's legitimate businesses. There's collaboration to be done helping sort of do education. And I think consumer education, there's a huge role for the FTC and in collaboration with others to play. We have a whole division that does business and consumer guidance, and they're trying to doing such important work and trying to make sure that people know when to spot a fraud, and when there's a new fraud that comes up, making sure we're addressing it and giving people questions to ask themselves. We have a ton of educational materials that we try to take a wholesale retail approach to. They're free, and we try to give them to groups to make sure they spread out widely in different communities, older Americans or other places where you see a particular type of fraud being prevalent. And so I think that sort of guidance, that consumer guidance, that education piece is key, and it is a crucial pillar of what we do at the FTC.
Well, I'd like to drill down to that a little bit. I'm a huge fan of what the FTC has done for consumer education over the years. Full disclosure, we are a contributor to your Consumer Sentinel database. We send thousands of complaints that we receive at our website, fraud.org, to Sentinel. We certainly rely on all the amazing data spotlights and the consumer education guides that your team puts out. But when it comes to AI-fueled fraud, right, I worry that consumers don't even know that the scam that they are being, the email they're getting, the phishing text they're getting, the instant message they're getting hit with, that there is a link to AI, right? So can you talk a little bit about the challenge as you see it of helping consumers navigate this coming sort of environment we're in, where so much of the fraud that they're going to be faced with stems from the use of AI by scammers?
Yeah, so I think you're right that it is difficult to sort of educate them on every sort of fraud tool that's being used. So I actually do think one key thing that we do is tell them how scammers operate in terms of what are they going to ask you to do, right? So that even if you think you're talking to your grandson on the phone and it's his voice, it's exactly right, or you've had a really effective phishing email. When someone says to you, you need to move, this is the government, you need to move your money to keep it safe, move it here this way. We're saying no one's going to tell you, no one legitimate is going to tell you to do that. There's a lot of payment methods people in the fraud world, who's really asking you to pay with a gift card? Who's asking you to go to the crypto ATM? So I think that's an important part of educating folks is talking about what are the hallmarks of scammers, and it tends to be how do they want to get money from you?
Got it. And you also mentioned earlier that the deadline for compliance, the Take It Down Act, is going to take effect very soon. For folks in the business community who are in the audience today or following this, are you planning any kind of advice or guidance to businesses on what they need to do to comply with this new law?
Sure. So I should say there's two parts of the Take It Down Act. One is sort of the criminal section of it, which has already taken effect and DOJ enforces, which is if you put up these criminal images, like you're liable for that. But there's also the sort of the component for platforms, which is they have a responsibility if they get a valid request to take it down, they have to take it down within 48 hours. And that is what we will be enforcing. And as with any sort of new law enforcement activity, new law that comes into effect, we tend to bring out guidance much closer to the date of the effective date. I will say that this Take It Down Act is very sort of important, has a lot of bipartisan support, and it's been just really heartening how much stakeholder outreach we've gotten. So like a lot of sort of help and good ideas have come from stakeholders, like from platforms, from survivors advocates, and so it's been a really positive experience to deal with something quite horrible.
Yeah. And Joe, we're talking about the Take It Down Act, which to me I think is a really important first step in this sense. I mean, I think we can all agree that sort of deepfake porn is a terrible thing that we shouldn't be encouraging and in fact should probably be prohibiting. But it's a law that was crafted and created in response to a problem that we saw. And so I was thinking about that in the context of sort of the old saw I hear about if you're trying to figure out the difference between European and American approaches to privacy and technology regulation. The Europeans tend to be sort of trying to write rules at first and then worry about enforcement down the road. Whereas in the U.S., we really focus more on enforcement as sort of the way to keep the marketplace safe. So when it comes to what's going on in the EU with these AI, the new AI bills that you talked about at the beginning, what can Europeans expect in terms of enforcement of those bills, of those laws? And is that something that you think is going to have a measurable impact on the problem? Because I think, as you pointed out, fraud knows no boundaries, right? Americans are getting scams, Irish people are getting scammed, my family in France is getting scammed, and we need rules of the road, but they have to be enforced. Otherwise, they're just words on paper. So can you talk a little bit about the European approach to enforcement in this space?
I think everybody would agree with you, John. I mean, especially the business organizations in Europe are very vocal about the importance of enforcement, because it's one thing, as you say, having good statutes on the book, but if they're not enforced properly, they're essentially worthless. I know that a lot of good work has also been done by Europol, because of course they're following this problem very closely. I would say that the key to enforcement is also co-opting the private sector. As you very correctly said, you pointed out the Aspen initiative is wonderful. I think you are showing the way to Europe in a sense, because I think this pragmatic approach is very valuable. It's very interesting, as you say, the different approaches. In the US, this initiative has been taken by a private organization. The equivalent initiative in Europe is being done by the European Central Bank. So the working party, the Euro Retail Payments Board, basically has been tasked with coming up with a blueprint for such a task force, and the deadline they have for that is the end of this year. So it'll be very interesting. I'm sure they'll be reading very carefully your report on the 1st of October, but they already have given the outlines of their approach. So they talk about various game changers. So it's not just the law, but it's how you implement the law. It's also prevention, so putting in the law sort of provisions about product design, so that in the sense that when a product comes to market, the design anticipates possible fraud. So that's one of the game changers mentioned in the recent report done by the task force. So yeah, in short, of course we agree. It's all the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So a law is no good unless it's enforced. But I would say also the European ambition in terms of regulation goes further than the US, but that's partly a cultural phenomenon, and certainly the AI Act. I think the ban on deepfakes is total. It's not restricted to a particular type of deepfake, or at least it may not be banned. There has to be an indication of the origin. There has to be kind of like a watermark or some kind of some sign demonstrating to the user that this is a deep fake.
And I'd like to talk about, this is a question for the entire panel, but deepfake seems to be sort of like the one use case of AI when it comes to its potential for fraud, that there seems to be consensus. Like, this is one area we can put our finger on and something should be done about this. Beyond the Take It Down Act, what more could we be doing, should we be doing to try and address the potential for fraudulent use of deepfake technology, whether it's audio deepfake or video deepfake? Those are the ones that I think keep me up at night. I told the story earlier in the day about sort of worrying about getting a call from my daughter. So what can we do on that piece? Kate, you're grabbing your microphone.
I am. I feel like we are at a moment in society where we have to make some really clear choices. And it's going to be hard to do, and we may not get there. But the way that we've talked about this is an ecosystem issue. Where do we want to put in place checks to know if it's a live person or not? Where do we want to be verifying identity or credentials? Is it a real business or is it not? And you think about that in terms of our online marketplaces and social media and telecommunications and financial services. It's a patchwork of places, of ways and forms in which we do those things right now. And that is what allows a lot of the criminality to creep in, because you can pop up and register a business fraudulently and put up a fake website and be selling investments to someone, right? And then, taking over someone's Facebook account and tell people to invest in this great new thing, right? So the chain here is pretty vast. And so this is where I really think about, like, the AI is a tool and a cog in that wheel a little bit. What we've been thinking a lot more about is, how do you prevent the criminal from doing the thing? And where are the system defenses in place? I will admit that the recommendations paper doesn't go all the way in terms of having a definitive set of things to do X, Y, or Z, but it poses a lot of really important questions that I think we have to grapple with as a society, to say, where are we willing to put those levers in? What are the pros and cons and the cost benefits of doing those things vis-a-vis the potential, both the potential harm to consumers, but also the potential business implications on innovation, et cetera. I think it's a really important moment in society to be having those conversations, because we are faced with this threat.
Jenny?
I think this is on, yeah. So I think these are the 6 areas that I laid out early on are also really good steps to look at. I think that there's this initial tendency with deepfakes to think that detection is going to be the best way to do it. And I think we are quickly learning that detection is probably not going to be the way to solve this. And I think more needs to be invested in things like provenance technologies and watermarking and fingerprinting and all those other things, and sometimes using that all together. We are founding members of the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is often referred to as C2PA. It's a great way to sort of track the provenance of where something came, where are the origins of it, and that is true for not just things that are created with AI, but it should be for all sort of digital content. But the reality of this is that it needs to be used by everybody and for all content, right? And until it is and more readily adopted, we're not going to be at that sort of solution stage. I also think the education piece is just really, really critical, and we need to be investing both, when people are really young and throughout all stages, because as we know, people are just not too particularly savvy about this. There's all sorts of tests out there, like can you spot the, AI generated content from the non-AI generated content, and most people cannot. It's really it's like 50-50, right? And that's just because people are guessing. And I think the more that your people are thinking and they're not reacting to the like, quick send me, some money, really, the more that we're educating our consumers to be able to stop and to think. And I don't think that's very different from whether it's AI generated or not AI generated. But I think those are things that I think we're going to get to the sort of those policy solutions, rather than investing in what we think are sort of these quick fixes.
And Jenny, I just want to drill down a little bit on that. Microsoft, your paper jumped out at me specifically because I see so few papers and output from companies who are building these platforms talking about this issue, sort of the worst case scenario of how the tools that you're investing billions of dollars in can be used. So from the point of view of Microsoft and a tool that you invest in, OpenAI, you have a huge investment in that. What is the threat to Microsoft and to a company like OpenAI if we don't get this right when it comes to misuse of these tools by fraudsters?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say two things on that. First, we have a long history of doing things in this sort of this abusive technology space. Microsoft, maybe 16 years ago, created PhotoDNA, which, for people who don't know, is the hash matching technology that is most used to detect child sexual abuse materials used by NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and used by law enforcement all over the world, and we license it. So we have a long history of feeling we have, as a tech company, we have a responsibility to be responsible actors in this space. So I would say that is the first thing. The second thing is that if you don't address the harms in the space, people are going to be less likely to adopt the technology. And we want people to adopt the technology. We want the technology to be used for good reasons and not to be used by bad actors. We are very aware, as a company that has been around for 50 years, that all technology, it's not just AI, but any technology in the hands of bad actors can do bad things. But we believe that we're obviously AI optimists and believe that it will do very, very good things, and we want it to be used that way.
Kate W., what can folks who are either who are in the industry or consumers who are facing this AI, the sort of the harm that's coming out of AI-fueled fraud, like what are their opportunities to communicate to the FTC about what can be done, both at the FTC level to address this? I mean, obviously we can file complaints with the FTC, but I don't always know that a particular scam I heard about was based on, it was using AI, right? We know you have the 6B letters, but are there opportunities for either platform developers or for the users of these new tools as they start to implement them in their businesses, in their schools, in their communities, to come to you and say, I think this tool can be used in ways that the people who developed it didn't expect it to, and that there's potential harm there. How do people sort of communicate that to the FTC, and is that input that's useful to you all as you develop policy in this space?
Sure. I mean, so I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug for reportfraud.com, reportfraud.ftc.gov. I don't know how I got it wrong the first time, but the second time I was right. Which is the way you can, let us know about particular scams you've seen or concerns you have that you've experienced, maybe a family member's experience, and that goes into our Consumer Sentinel network, which is a very important enforcement tool. And I maybe you will not hear from us probably directly, like that, oh yeah, we're definitely going to look into this because our information, like our investigations are non-public, and you only know about something when we're at the final stages. But it's very important. But folks reach out to us all the time with, their ideas or their concerns. I mean, Mark told you all about the long petitions and complaints and letters that he's submitted over the years. We've certainly seen them all. We take them seriously, and so we have sort of the open policy. You send us something, we'll look at it, and we do.
And beyond the FTC, I mean, the President Trump put out his AI action plan, and we're talking. The action plan, I think, is looking at a whole of government approach to this issue. So can you talk a little bit about what the FTC is doing in conjunction with the White House, with other agencies who are looking at this problem? If I was, wondering about, what the SEC is going to do, what the OCC might do, what any of the other alphabet soup of organizations, the NTIA is looking at this. How are other agencies looking at this, and how is the FTC working with them to address this problem?
So there's a whole of government approach, and in the various spheres using their authorities, each agency is thinking critically about how they can address the problem. And of course, we coordinate often with other agencies. We have MOUs. We meet with them. We have discussions. I'm not sure what more I could sort of provide beyond that, other than to say it's 100% a priority that we are sort of tackling the problems and the places where AI is violating law and being misused without being like a super regulator, and sort of we are very pro innovation. We want to be competitive in the world. We know there's great promise for these tools, and so certainly like no one in the administration is trying to quash that.
And I'm sorry, I've focused specifically on federal agencies, but we obviously know that states have a role to play as well. And several of the panelists on our previous panels talked about this. What is the coordination that the FTC is doing with the states and the state AGs? And how are you interfacing with sort of these emerging sets of AI state laws to address this growing problem of AI fueled fraud?
So certainly we do not enforce state laws, right?
Right.
So there's that. But to the extent that we often partner with states, and so to the extent where we have a fraud case, we might have multiple state partners, right? And so we'll bring our counts under Section 5 or whatever other like rule might or statute might apply. States will add their own. Maybe they'll add their AI statute. I haven't seen that yet, but like it's very possible. But we do partner with all 50 states in a variety of matters, and I don't think this will be any different when we're talking about AI fraud.
Got it. Thank you. Joe, as somebody who's written a great deal about this issue, and you're talking to other academics in this space, what are some of the regulatory approaches that your colleagues in academia are looking at when it comes to addressing the threat of AI-fueled fraud?
I would say a couple of things. If I could also come back to what Jenny was saying a few moments ago about consumer awareness. I mean, I've worked for a long time in consumer policy, and the one constant is how important it is to consumer awareness and consumer education and making the consumer aware. I think that I've seen a study on the psychology in AI-driven scams and so on, and you cannot. The scammers take advantage of people's psychology, of human psychology, and they want to create a sense of urgency, or like you're saying, and they often have data, and they know that you're in a particular situation. So the consumer is not to blame, really, for what's happening. So the onus, in a way, I think, is on government and the private sector to prevent. So I think prevention, in my view, is the absolute key. So combined with awareness, because you can't prevent everything, so you want the consumer to be as aware as possible, and you also want to give the consumer some means of redress. So it's interesting in the current discussions around the Payment Services Directive, the question of what comeback a consumer has, and whether there should be, the European Parliament is pushing for the use of mediation or arbitration as much as possible, and to have sort of more broader, stronger rules. That doesn't really answer your question, but they're the kind of the key elements that have come out of my, my own investigations into this field.
Got it. Thank you. And I'd like to talk about incentives. We've talked about this on a little in different ways around on the other panels, but from a business point of view, what are the incentives that regulation can provide, either positive or negative incentives, that would get a company like Microsoft or other people in your industry to devote more resources to trying to make sure that these models are safer as they get deployed into to the public. Mark, on the previous, when we were doing the keynote, talked about the need for more testing for safety, and then we had a conversation about what does safe actually mean. But are there? I mean, are the incentives already enough? Would a tax break for testing your model for fraud protection be helpful? Jenny, I think that's probably a question for you, but happy to have others chime in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're thinking like maybe federal bills, maybe there's this harmonization aspect of it, right? I think you mentioned also in your talk about like patchwork of state bills, right? Although generally fraud is something we do sort of see as delegating to the states, and the bill that was talking about before actually does give power to state attorneys general and wouldn't preempt state bills. But a lot of times when we're talking about things in the AI space, we do look for a federal bill to sort of set what are the expectations, and I think like that is in a newish field, like that is very helpful to companies. I do think like there are certain things like that are helpful to companies to sort of lay out what are the expectations, setting that across the landscape. But I do think it does help in terms of we know and we have known that like there are concerns, right? If you ask people out there, like, what are your concerns on AI? I think like deepfakes is one of the things that comes up, like the top one, right? Or one of the top, 2 or 3. And one of the things that can help are to address it through policy ways and legislation, and that I think would be helpful to companies. But if it's done in a smart way, right? I don't think these like very large, not targeted attempts are going to be the way that most companies are going to want to have this addressed, but smart targeted legislation. And we endorse the Take It Down Act because it was a real issue with a real targeted harm that had a very concrete way to do it. And I think AI fraud is another one where it is a targeted issue we know that this issue is going to be exacerbated or is being by AI, and a targeted approach on how to address it is also something that I think most companies would welcome. So I think it just is a matter of how you do it. And also you don't want to have it be done differently in, each individual state and have tons of different ways and have to modify it depending on, where you're operating. So I think those are all things to consider.
Got it. And Kate G, part of the task force's real appeal, at least to me, has been the focus on running on this sort of incentives theme, the incentives for better information sharing, right? When we hear a lot about sort of the fraud chain, so the consumer who gets a text message saying, click on this link. That's a text message that came in through their wireless carrier. The text message, the text of the text message says your Amazon package hasn't been delivered. So this implicates Amazon. You click on the link, you're taken to a lookalike website where you're asked to put in payment details. This implicates the banking system. If you figure out that you've been defrauded, you may file a complaint with the FTC or your state AG. So now you have, in this sense, potentially 4 different entities who all have signals about a possible fraud, but I don't know that they are necessarily putting them all together in a way that would actually help that individual consumer, who's the sort of the common denominator in that entire fraud chain I talked about, avoid being scammed in the future, or other people like her being scammed in the future with that better intelligence. We talked on the panel 2 today about things like the Global Signals Exchange. But I know that the task force, not to preempt, not to let the cat out of the bag, but information sharing is a big theme of it. What is the need here for sort of formalized mechanisms to share these fraud signals? How important are they? And within the task force or in your own experience, what are the challenges that exist to that kind of information sharing?
I mean, I could talk for the rest of the time about
Okay.
this, so just cut me off when you need to. It's a great example that you give because each of the entities that you named will tell you what the legal and compliance issues are with their ability to share that data. So for financial services, there was a gentleman earlier who brought up 314B. Patriot Act 314B allows for financial services institutions to share information with each other for fraud prevention purposes. Fraud. Are scams included? Question mark. These are real questions real lawyers ask, right? In terms of thinking about where is my legal risk and compliance in this issue? That's one element of it. So are the financial institutions in your example able to share a signal if the consumer comes to them and says, this was a fraudulent payment, I got scammed? Can the bank then share that information up to everybody else in the chain? And that is a real question because it's unclear whether 314B covers that. It's unclear whether the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act covers that issue because scams are not listed as a covered set of information in those laws. And so the ability for each of those entities to share that information, which kinds of data and information, what are the privacy considerations, and how can we act on that information, are the whole set of questions that we looked at in the task force. And then, to layer on top of that, which information is actionable and is actually going to lead to a greater set of takedowns of that criminal behavior. And so things like the Global Signal Exchange are really promising starts because they've figured out some of the legal issues at play for the participating companies to pilot some exchanges of information that not only allows them to figure out some of the legal issues at play, the technological issues at play in terms of how that data is being transferred and the privacy protections that are needed in there, but also then what is the impact of acting on that information? Which data is actually going to lead to the impact that we want to have, right? Which is reducing the harm to consumers. And so it's that whole host of sets of questions that are really important to try to figure out. And in addition to that, I told you I could talk forever about this, but
I'll cut you off when I need to.
okay. But the other piece in addition to that is the Global Signal Exchange is one of many examples right now in the marketplace of different attempts at information sharing or existing information sharing fora like the ISACs. And so there's also now, for business leaders being confronted with this issue, also a sense of like, where do I put my time and money? Where do I start to share information? What's going to be useful to me? What is the cost? So that's a host of issues. And how do I understand the marketplace? And how do we, because it is a network effects problem, like the place that you want the most information to be shared is that the more information and data that you have that is actionable, the better impact that we will have on the crime. And then the last piece is, if I as a company act on this information and I'm wrong, and I take down an account, is there a civil case? Is there other kind of liability? You're gonna tell me, but there's a whole host of kind of questions that lawyers start to ask around, sure, we all want to prevent this consumer harm, but what am I exposing my company to in terms of a set of risks for acting on that information? And that's another set of legal murkiness issues. And so, anyway, it's a really interesting puzzle. There's a lot of interesting promise. I have heard some really great examples of the impact of some of these pilots that I think show a lot of great promise, where they're sort of really targeting specific parts of the scam life cycle. But ultimately, we're going to need to figure out what is possibly a uniform set of provisions that allow for the exchange of that information.
And for Kate White, in this fraud chain I described, right? Sort of I get the text message for Amazon, that I then go to my banker, then I might come to the FTC. Thinking about this from the regulatory point of view, there are at least 3, potentially 4 different regulatory agencies that may have hooks into each part of that fraud chain. So from your point of view and the authority that the FTC has, how do you deal with a consumer who comes to you who says, I've been targeted by a scam that started off with this fraudulent SMS message, not to pick on my wireless industry friends, but and it may have got to me because of AI or have a deepfake component to it at some point in it. How do you determine what parts of that crime you have the ability to investigate and what parts other agencies may need to get involved with?
So, as with everything and law enforcement, it's fact specific, right? Like you look and you see like what are our authorities, what are the facts here, like what cases can we bring? We do a lot of coordination with folks, and I would say the friends in the telecom industry, the Traceback Group, that is helpful to multiple. It's helpful to the FCC, it's helpful to the FTC, it's helpful to industry. So those sorts of cooperations or sharing is useful. If we see activity, like we see a lot of complaints or we find conduct and we're like, oh, this is criminal, we will refer it to criminal authorities. So certainly there's coordination there when you say, like, this isn't something that falls within our jurisdiction, but we think it's someone else's, and we'll let them know.
Great, thank you. Joe, when I was talking to Mark, one of the things that you talked about was how European laws like the GDPR end up having knock-on effects in terms of privacy protection for American consumers. How do you see laws like the ones you described in the EU regulating AI benefiting American consumers from the perspective of fraud protection?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's certainly the case that the GDPR, the European Law on Privacy, has had what's called the Brussels effect. This term was actually originally derived from the California effect. The idea that if California adopts a law, everybody else has to go along with it because California sets the standard, and because the Europeans were the first to legislate on privacy, and because this gained such international currency, and also the fact that industry was obliged, in a sense, so to enter the European market, you have to comply with European privacy rules. So, this became known as the Brussels effect. I'm not convinced the same thing will happen with the AI Act, possibly partly because the jury is out. We don't know yet because it hasn't been yet applied. Only a small part of the AI Act is in force, so we don't really know how effective it will be. But certainly, the academics I'm talking to believe that it's less well designed than the GDPR. I know the GDPR is criticized a lot, but AI Act is criticized even more. So it's difficult to know. But there is I think I have this feeling that the AI Act is not being picked up in quite the same way as the privacy legislation was. I mean, Brazil has recently passed something very close to the AI Act. And of course, there are laws in various states. I think Texas has a law which is, not too dissimilar, or at least draft law. And Colorado also has a law which is closer to being on the statute book. So these are sort of variations on the theme. But I think at this stage, today, it's very difficult to say what kind of international impact it will have. But I would like to say, though, following on to what you were just discussing, and it was the piece I'd forgotten in answer to your earlier question, was the importance of sort of international collaboration. So I think as Abigail said this morning, this is very difficult. So collaboration across jurisdictions and across sectors is very difficult. But I think that's the way forward, since, as we've been saying, the problem is global and the problem is dynamic, because the fraudsters are adapting all the time. They're changing their modus operandi all the time, and they can move. They're more agile in a sense than the regulators are. So the regulators have to be try to be correspondingly more agile.
Great.
If I may, are you going to ask the question about this single policy measure, or
yes, please tell me
mentioned
about
it this morning? But I just want to say that I asked AI that question yesterday in preparation for this panel. What would be the single sort of the magic policy instrument? And it told me that the magic silver bullet would be a mandatory cross-sector AI fraud intelligence exchange. So obviously we're with what we heard about this morning about the global signal exchange, I think we're on the right track somehow.
Good.
At least according to if AI is right. On
Which
this.
model? Which did you ask several models that? Did you ask several different LLMs that?
I only asked this. I don't know if I should say it, but
Well, it's a safe space. But if you don't want to feel comfortable, that's okay.
I think better not to say it.
All right. So we are at the time in the program where we hand the mic over to you and our audience. We have an amazing panel here of experts on the policies we need to help stop the bad guys and help the good guys. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And while we are getting to our first questioner, I did want to take the opportunity to make a plug for the new paper that NCL has released today called Deepfakes, Chatbots, and Scams, How AI is Fueling Fraud and What Policymakers Must Do. It's a fantastic paper put together by my colleague Eden Ishel, our summer intern Audrey Smith, and myself, looking at dozens of state and federal bills that have been proposed on AI and how they can apply to protecting consumers from AI fraud. We put them into nice buckets for you so you can see where they all come together. So I would highly recommend, if you get a chance after this conference, take a look at our paper. So do we have any questions in the audience? Knew if I waited long enough, we'd have an uncomfortable silence and you all would raise your hands. So right here in the back, and then we'll go to you right here.
Hi, this is Michael Herndon, CFPB. I guess I'm thinking about, it's been a great conversation today, is fraud different now than it's ever been? And maybe this is a question for FTC. Is it we're just seeing so much more of it? Is it we're seeing so much more sophistication? Is it grown? You know, there's been Ponzi schemes since the 1920s when Mr. Ponzi created the Ponzi scheme, and it's been the same ever since. So I guess I'm just thinking the panelists is this a different moment in time, or is it just it's a different flavor of fraud? You know, what is your take on like now versus 20 years ago versus 50 years ago?
I think it's the same as it's ever been. The technology changes, the scams maybe there's a slightly new flavor, but I mean, look, the FTC Act is like 100 years old, right? And it was written and Congress writes it, and they make it very flexible because they know that they can't just write every scam and every technology into the law. People are always going to adapt. They're always going to change. So they gave us tools to combat it. And I just think, you know, for forever there have been frauds, and so I think we confront new technologies and maybe we think like this is very sophisticated, it feels very scary. I feel eventually we'll get to a place where people recognize the new tactics more easily, and then we'll move on to the next thing. So I'm not like overly concerned that we've suddenly like had some sort of we're at this horrible place that we've never been to before, or that we don't have ways to combat it. I'm much more optimistic.
Anybody else want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like media manipulation is like as old as time, right? I mean, like people have been doing it forever. I mean, you know, Stalin and Hitler used media manipulation, and like people lost their minds when like Photoshop came out. And so yeah, this is a new tool. But it is a very sophisticated tool, and so yeah, is it going to change what it looks like and how people are doing it and how they're targeting? Yes. So that's there are it's got a different element, but it is I think a lot of the same lessons that have been used before are going to still apply.
I'm just a bit more pessimistic. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. So am I.
Just in terms of I think in terms of my own learning journey about this problem. So, I mean, reports to the FBI have tripled in the last 6 years of this kind of fraud. And so, to take your point, though, I think the nature of it in terms of like scams itself are a fundamentally unique crime, I think, in that it really leverages the consumer and convinces them to make a payment to someone that they believe is really who they say they are. And that I think that I think, yes, I understand like Ponzi schemes are the exact same thing, but I do think that there's something unique about that as separate from other kinds of fraud we've learned how to combat, particularly in the financial services world.
Joe?
I think I might take an intermediate position. I think the acceleration, of course, basically, the fraud has always been there and the same tricks, but the acceleration is so great and so vast that maybe we're in new territory. Maybe it's become something new. So I sort of tend to sort of lean towards the Aspen Institute on this point.
And I would say, I think, while I agree that the schemes that they are promoting are the same schemes that have been promoted forever, the Ponzi schemes, the impersonation schemes, et cetera, the difference with AI is that it expands the aperture of people who can commit fraud. You don't need to have the same skill sets to commit fraud that you did before the advent of AI. Now, anyone with access to a ChatGPT can write a convincing phishing email. It also means that the ability to personalize your solicitations to potential victims is that much better, because you can take in so much more data and then output it in the form of a deepfake video or a phishing text or something else in a much more convincing way. So you have a bigger pool of potential victims. So I actually think that AI is as big a game changer when it comes to fraud as the advent of the internet was 30 years ago. And so I think we need to have a very serious policy conversation about what to do about this, and building on the lessons we've learned from 30 years of dealing with online fraud and scams. And that's part of why we asked you all to be here today. I think we have time for one more question. And I think I know you had a question. No, you're good? All right. Ruth, I see your hand raised. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you do? Oh, you do have a question. Okay, I thought you were waving me off. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you all for the panel and for this event. My question is around incentives. I think the panel before this, we talked about this possibly being a powerful policy solution. So I was wondering if you had any insight on what kind of incentives we would be able to use, whether that is from lessons learned from other fields or from things that you already see working in the AI realm.
I can chime in. This is going to be a bit of a controversial take on it, but I do think we need to have a conversation about the L word, which is liability. This is something that I think can create a powerful incentive for companies to take investing in security seriously. The example I always come back to on this is our credit and debit cards. Why is it that I get a phone call from my bank when somebody uses my credit card to buy a big screen TV when I just bought a Starbucks? Well, they bought the big screen TV in California. I bought a Starbucks across the street here 2 minutes ago. It's because because the banks are on the hook for those fraud losses if I charge it back. And so they have a huge incentive to invest in making their systems as safe as possible. And I know that that is not an apples to apples comparison to what we're talking about today. But I keep coming back to it because it seems like a liability regime that actually works for consumers. And there's a lot of potential unintended consequences in there. I fully recognize that. But it's something I think is needs to be part of the conversation that is often verboten when we talk about technology, when we talk about the role, the safeguards and guardrails for AI technology. But that's my hot controversial take for the day. So happy to let other folks chime in on incentives if you'd like.
No, just I mentioned that sort of earlier when I was talking about the Payment Services Directive. The real hot potato in the negotiation is the liability regime. So in fact, I think a lot of people in Europe would agree with what John just said.
Jenny, I feel like you might have a different opinion.
I do, but I also think I'm probably not the best suited to say it. I mean, I spoke to a lot of stakeholders when we were working on putting together this legislation that we've been working on, including a lot of small tech companies. And a lot of small tech companies, I think, would have more to say about this than we would. And I know that sounds like a very easy answer for us, but I think that's true, because I think we would be able to take on that regulatory burden more so than a tech startup.
Very fair point. Well, if I could get a round of applause for our panelists here. Thank you all for making time and for sharing your expertise. And I would just like to say, as we close out the day, thank you to our amazing hosts here at GW. You've been amazing. The feedback I've gotten about this venue has been incredible. So thank you, Aurélien, and your entire team for the great job today. Thank you to all of our sponsors who helped make today possible. We wouldn't be here without your support of NCL and this conference. And thank you all for making time to come out today. I know that there's a lot of events happening in DC, particularly this time of year. So your decision to be here and share this experience with us and learn more about where we see this problem, what's being done to address it, and what more can be done to try and protect consumers is really incredibly valuable. Please fill out your surveys if you can. We'll also be following up with an email to you as well about this. We really would appreciate the feedback. And thank you once again. Thank you to everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you all.